Kubernetes, it's different underlying providers, right? So it's never going to just run in multiple places. And you've effectively got multiple data centers with completely different providers. And I think that the time that
Hello, welcome to Cloud Unplugged. This is season 2, episode 8. I am here with Richard Smith from Codification. I'm Jon Shanks. Richard, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'll just give you a potted history, John. So I started working in IT back in 2001, originally as a technician, and then I moved into infrastructure engineering, doing things like setting up data centers with VMware. In 2012, that's when I became an independent contractor. So I did site reliability engineering for the London Olympics. I helped a startup go to cloud, basically from a software product to a SaaS product. Helped a housing company get off their physical data center into private cloud, so third-party cloud. And about 8 years ago, that's when the assignments became kind of around cloud native and DevOps. So I was the DevOps lead for Department of Work and Pensions, and I'd got their first microservice live, known as the Pension Tracing Service. That same year, 2016, was also when I joined HSBC as their enterprise architect for platforms. So that was also about cloud, so AWS this time. But cloud native as well, about exploring microservice style architectures. And then the last project that I did before kind of being full-time codification CEO was HMRC. So that was their roll on, roll off project, which is better known as the Brexit platform. So I did the architecture for that. And all of those projects were supposed to be about agility and DevOps. And I could see these kind of recurring patterns of failure, patterns of success as well, but lots of the same mistakes being repeated. So that's when I decided to set up Codification. So I hired the first employee back in April 2019, and that's what I do now. So now we work with enterprises with in-house engineering teams and help them on the same kind of journey, adopting cloud native.
Nice. And the challenges that you're helping customers with at current and at the moment and previously, that's all. What is the type of constraints that you're more focused on? Is it around modernization or applications itself, or is it more like cloud infrastructure automation, or a bit of all of it? Is it all of those things?
I mean, it is a bit of all of it sometimes when we're kind of very heavily involved with the client, but mainly platform engineering is the sweet spot. So it is around like adopting Kubernetes mainly, but of course that then breaks into CI/CD. It breaks into the whole dev and ops and breaking down the organizational silos, and then it bleeds into everything else where they don't necessarily have the talent in house. So training the talent, hiring the talent, onboarding them, showing them the way, all of those sorts of things as well.
Right, I see. That's really good. So the stuff around the talent side, is that the biggest constraint? Obviously, Kubernetes, I think, is a big topic, obviously, and we're in that space too. So we kind of see how complicated. Well, it is just complicated, and that's just factual. What it's trying to do is complicated. So is that what you're seeing quite a lot? The challenges is people struggling for adoption in Kubernetes. It's harder than they thought it was going to be, or is it?
Yeah, definitely. So it's the lack of talent on the market for fast follow companies. So of course, the very large tech companies don't struggle with this as much, of course. But outside of those, I think there's a shortage of talent for one thing, and then it's precisely what you said. It's very easy to underestimate. In some ways, it feels like cloud native is like an order of magnitude jump up from virtualization and complexity. So it's very easy for organizations who've done relatively okay with provisioning data centers and in-house application development to assume, okay, it's that kind of paradigm shift. And I feel as though, from what I've seen over the years, that it's much harder than that. And yeah, the complexity catches people off guard.
And what do you think is driving the adoption of Kubernetes? Is it more like the market, or is it technologists coming in representing the need in the business and then trying to implement? I guess, what do you feel like it's people that come in that then drive the adoption of Kubernetes, in like they make the decision for the business, or the business has recognized the value of the technology for what they need? Or do you still think it's a bit disconnected, like the technology's still focused on the technologists without the true value of understanding of why Kubernetes, um,
Yeah, I
or
think
both?
there's a bit of that where the tail's wagging the dog, where the implementation technology, Kubernetes or containerization's chosen first. But I think, early days, I guess, like 2015, it was this agnosticism idea of like, they'd experienced customers had experienced vendor lock-in before and were terrified of that.
Mm.
And so there was like, can we build on an abstraction layer? Can we be, multi cloud or tool agnostic or whatever? So I think that was driving it earlier. Now I actually think, and I don't know, we'll get into that probably, but I don't know that I fully agreed with those sentiments. But I think now it is kind of that there's a pressure from the customer to be omni-channel or to release software quickly, and actually to achieve that, you do need microservices, and that then demands a cloud native approach, which then Kubernetes is the only game in town. But actually, when I started doing this sort of thing, there was other valid options. Swarm was quite big at the time, so we were doing a lot of Swarm stuff. So I don't think it's Kubernetes as the driver, but probably like microservices style architecture and needing to independently deploy services to do omni-channel is probably what it is now.
Yeah, so like more containers themselves on like being more portable and slim, which more developer friendly really than a VM,
Yeah,
which is
yeah,
where I mean, devs would never really be spinning VMs up or doing Vagrant. That was always like infrastructure
exactly.
related, wasn't it? And then suddenly you could then actually start packaging up your application into something like Docker, and then that became easier for developers. And then Kubernetes came out later, didn't it? Really, because it was just Docker at the beginning mostly, and then Kubernetes came later. Mesos Marathon, Swarm, then obviously Kubernetes. So, but
Yeah,
yeah,
that's what we saw people successfully adopt containers. Probably not true microservices, but containerizing to do lift and shift. So finding that relatively doable in-house, and then a lot of our customers came from those that then got stuck either trying to get it into production, or they're in production and trying to scale it, or even more often they're kind of in production at some kind of scale but can't tell when it breaks why it's broke. So the observability stuff and stack tracing and that sort of thing. So I think it all comes back to lack of platform engineering talent. So it's good development talent, maybe good system engineering, but that kind of crossover skill set is missing in
yeah,
most and still now, right?
yeah. I agree with that. I find it interesting. Like platform engineering is kind of like funny because the term, because it's been around probably for a while, but it's then either maybe like the central model versus disaggregated model. So it's like depending on how you perceiving it, if you're just having people in projects, and you probably wouldn't call that platform engineering, you just call that like DevOps, DevOps embedded in a team delivering
Yeah.
with the application team. But then the minute you kind of rolled into something central, see that actually that model, there's not enough consistency or oversight, or you're kind of relying on documentation and standards and all these other things to try and coerce some consistent approach or some security model, and then kind of centralizing it was a better option because at least it's in one place, like you're doing everything in one place.
Yeah.
But then that's risen to the concept of platform engineering, is in like engineering everything in a central place. But the term platform obviously is so used that it became, like the cloud's a platform, isn't it? Or there's like platforms everywhere, platforms as a service, all these different phrases.
Yeah.
So it's quite confusing. I'm not sure whether people do understand what platform engineering
I
means.
don't
So
think
it's
they
probably
do, but DevOps suffers the same curse, doesn't it? That
True. Yeah.
DevOps seemed to me to start out like agile. So it was a culture of automation, or a culture of breaking down organizational silos, that sort of thing. And then I was called a DevOps engineer at one point. So that's kind of an anti-pattern in my mind. So that term also gets misused. Like DevOps engineer, should that be a thing? Or but then there's, like you say, there's this kind of federated view of where you have someone embedded in the team, and sometimes they call that site reliability engineer. but whatever. Yeah, I think for us, we use it because that's what we're doing. So it fits with our organization because we are specifically building a platform, whether it's a cloud landing zone, or it's a Kubernetes platform, or whatever. So that's what we're doing. I think it's a separate question of, should non-technology companies that are, finance company becoming fintech, or health becoming, like, should you have that, either of those concepts? Should you have a DevOps team or a platform engineering team? I think probably no. But we need one because that's what we're typically being contracted to do.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It is very confused, isn't it? Because there's loads of people brand themselves as different things. I don't think a lot of people can keep up with the terminologies and the trends, because obviously it's rapid, isn't it? And there's so many different paradigms on top of it. Like you're saying, SRE, obviously born out of Google, is mostly about scale. They were high scale, so you can kind of expect the need to be reliably engineering for the scale that you've got to, so it doesn't go down and that you can perform well. And then DevOps, obviously, is more of a methodology than a role, got coined mostly by recruiters, maybe, in truth. And then people were like branded as an engineer. And then there was a period where there were two, like, people kept using them interchangeably, like, oh, I'm an SRE, but they were kind of just doing engineering in a project, maybe. So it's still really DevOps, because it wasn't that they were doing reliability engineering. And then platform engineering happened at the same time. And then platform engineering with DevOps and SREs, because some companies have like all of them on the go. Don't they? Like different shapes and sizes. And it is quite complicated to know who's doing what are the roles and responsibilities of everybody.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Do you want to give your opinion on what, like, the value of platform engineering is versus DevOps versus SRE that you see in customers, just to clarify things a bit?
I mean, I think if I adopt the stance of the customer, so if the customers, let's say they're a software enterprise, or a bank trying to release digital banking products or whatever, right? They should want to concentrate on building the product. And so I think what you want is that to just be abstracted away and be self-service. Now, there's a roadmap, there's a transformation to get to that point. But I think as a target state, that's where you want to end up. And therefore, should the organization care about all of these things? So this is what I see on a typical transformation program. They're trying to get to grips, even still, with agile. A lot of people are still waterfall mindset, Prince 2, service management. So you've got that they're trying to understand. They're trying to understand the transformation strategy, the vision from the organization itself. They're trying to understand now this DevOps thing, and, like you say, maybe even 2 or 3 other competing things. And I think that's a bad idea. I think probably under the covers, you want automation. So you want that part of DevOps. You probably want the eat your own dog food concept of, if you build it, you look after it in production. So I think you want the DevOps culture part. I think you need platform engineering to get there, right? In a typical enterprise, it's going to be 1 to 5 years, depending on how much budget you put up front and how serious you are about, and how many mistakes you make along the way. So, but that should be transitional in my view, and then you should end up with something that's self-service for the developer. What do you think?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think, I'm not sure. I think what's difficult probably for customers is knowing when you need something. Like, what are the markers that tell you when you need to change? Because I guess every company is so different, yet the terminologies are kind of singular. They're not conditionalized. So it's just like platform engineering is platform engineering, DevOps is DevOps, but there's no condition of like which one do I choose. If I'm a small company, am I going DevOps straight away, or like do I hire a lead in a small team who understands cloud or has maybe got some DevOps principle knowledge? I think that's quite hard because there's no real good guidance probably on like what it means. And then large enterprises who are probably straddling really complicated environments, and that's nothing to do with the strategy. That's just history. Like you've been around long enough
Yeah.
to have been on a data center because you predate cloud, right?
Yeah.
So like that's just a historical thing. And so then you're into like a totally different type of business. And so what they're trying to do might be completely different. Their needs will be completely different to say a really small company that's born in the cloud. So I do think it is hard for people to know what does it all mean to me, like my company, when do I need these resources and when's a good time to invest, and
Yeah.
in that as a principle, because most of the time I think people are getting people in when they've got the problem, rather than then they're in a bit of a mess, so then they're seeking help because they've got them land themselves in a bit of a mess rather than understanding how they're going to evolve in
Yeah.
to delivery. But
Yeah. And you see
yeah,
this like cargo cult thing of, this organization wants to do it because its competitors are all doing it without really understanding why. I think that's
yeah,
the tail wagging the dog. I mean, for me, it should come from like a clearly articulated business strategy, and then whoever's doing strategy in IT should articulate, this is the vision, this is the strategy, and then it can follow from that if that's clear, right? If what are we trying to do? Are we trying to reduce? Is our main priority to reduce time to market? Is it cost saving?
yeah,
What is it? Because that might dictate a different path. Are we wanting to bring all of the incumbent staff, suppliers, whatever on the journey? That would obviously tell you a lot about what you should do. And I think where it goes wrong is if you just kind of go to market, start hiring for buzzwords, then you can end
yeah,
up in quite a mess because you don't understand why you're doing it, right?
yeah, exactly. And it's the same with all the like you were talking even about multi-cloud, we'll come on to in a minute, but even those things strategically aren't necessarily tied to business outcomes. Like what's the driver of multi-cloud exactly, or people saying hybrid, and it's like, right, our strategy is hybrid. And like, how is that an actual strategy? Because it's not
It isn't,
business
is it?
driven. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like, what is the outcome what do you get at the end of hybrid? And like, what was the cost? Did you save money? Did you not save money? Like, what was the objective actually? So there's all these things that are termed strategies, but they're not really strategies because
I agree
they're
with you.
not.
I don't see how
Yeah,
that can be it gets termed as a strategy, but I've never heard a CIO or a strategist in an organization articulate why that's a strategy. Ultimately, when they articulate it, it's a tactic, right? It's not a
yeah,
strategy. It's we're on-prem and would like to be fully in X cloud. And so we're hybrid. Well, yeah, that's just a state of being rather than a strategy, right? So yeah,
yeah.
but I think maybe the same thing could be true of having multiple public clouds as well. I don't know what you think about that, but is that a strategy? Is that a meaningful strategy that you've heard articulated?
From finances, from financial institutions. I mean, over here in the UK, obviously have the PRA, which is like the regulatory body. I'm not sure they say you have to be multi-cloud. I think it's then a bit like anything Chinese whispers. I think they say something around the resiliency there, and obviously from like data recovery perspectives and uptime, etc. Like, or if the cloud was to go bankrupt, that for whatever reason, that you've diversified enough to like reduce the risk. I don't think they ever say that then means you have to be multi-cloud. It just
Yeah,
means you need to get out of jail card, right? Basically, I think is really what they're saying. But I think just what you were saying before on the effort it can take some companies to even do one, and the lack of understanding and the hiring and the talent and everything else. I mean, my view, I'll ask yours as well, is like it seems almost impossible to do two clouds after you've done one. I don't know if you're agree with that, and that maybe puts like value and reward, isn't it? It's like, is there value in it? What's the reward of doing both? And is it worth the effort in the end? So I don't know
I mean,
about
I've
you.
never seen anyone pull it off, as in like they're actually achieved the strategic aim of being either on the one hand getting the best out of both clouds. So sometimes that's the use case, right? Of like we want to use Google for developer experience and AWS for maturity, or AWS
Yeah,
for maturity and Azure to be close to the data lake. Or so you sometimes hear that as a reason, and I've never seen that realized. And then the other reason is, resiliency and availability over multi for that reason, and I've never seen that either. So I think, these surveys come out and they say how, there's more people doing multi-cloud than single, but I don't, I kind of imagine that there's a very, very small subset of those that are actually achieving the original
yeah,
aim.
yeah. I totally agree with that. I have seen the using the right cloud for the right job, but I think you have to be quite mature to know how to do that, as in to have achieved. I guess if you can think about the infrastructure as separate from application in some ways, that if you can think that the application has dependencies outside of like how I run as a workload, and then the app dependencies could be like a database or an object storage or something that are much more simplistic than say infrastructure and networking is. Then if you can make the infrastructure and the networking very service driven, as in like a service, then it can work, but that takes a lot of design and upfront thinking
It's a
to then
trade-off though, isn't it? Like it can work, but I think unless, like you said, regulatory compliance maybe could be one reason. But I didn't see that as a diktat when I was at HSBC when they were doing it. So they wanted agnosticism because maybe feared competition or other things like that, right? But so maybe if you're so large, maybe if you're in the top 500 largest organizations in the world, it can make sense. Maybe if there's true regulatory compliance. So Middle Eastern banks, for example, so they maybe have a real case where they can't be on one American public cloud. So that probably makes sense. But short of those, the challenge is going to be what we were talking about before, right? It's going to be the sprawl and the lack of talent to be able to do one. So which mid-size or even large but not super large organization has the luxury of, the trade-off, right? To try and do two is going to essentially mean that you're going to take 3 times as long to accomplish the same goals as just focusing on one, I would say.
yeah. Just a minute, I'm gonna have to stop. In terms then of because you're talking about like compliance and the security aspect of things. So when you're promoting platform engineering, are you seeing that as a better methodology on achieving the regulatory needs for cloud and things like that, even if it was like multi-cloud or single cloud approaches, and you're getting that there, and that's and then if you are doing that, sorry, it's a bit of too many questions for you, but if you are doing that, then does platform engineering then make multi-cloud easier? In theory,
Well, I think multi-cloud always makes it harder from an engineering point of view, obviously, because you've got two different providers to deal with. So, even if you kind of use consistent tooling as like Terraform and Docker and Kubernetes, it's different underlying providers, right? So it's never going to just run in multiple places. And, you've effectively got multiple data centers with completely different providers in. I think that the time that a hybrid strategy makes sense is maybe this example of you have uh, data sovereignty concerns, legitimate data sovereignty concerns, and therefore you're on-prem for core systems, so core banking systems or government in the case of foreign governments, right? And you want to make use of cloud for point of presence or things like edge, so you want to do IoT stuff. So that would be a legitimate strategy where you would have multi-cloud in the sense of something private VMware or Red Hat or Oracle or something like that, some private cloud running Kubernetes, and then some Azure or something that runs stateless
But could,
applications. So
but
we
could
see
you do
that sort of thing.
that? Sorry, could you do that though with just because the data sovereignty is the data, not the workload?
Well, yeah. So you have some workloads that are maybe stateful, and
Yeah,
even maybe you consider even user information, sovereign data, which would be the case in like a Middle Eastern bank, let's say. Um, so that would need to be private, and then there's like a very narrow circumstance in which you can use public cloud, where it's like completely anonymized, so the workloads are purely non-customer, like they're interacting with an edge device or something like that. So you see that sort of thing. So that would be legitimate, pretty edge case though, right?
yeah, yeah. Very, very niche. But I guess I struggle a little bit because the architecture design that then drives, because there's so much to now, from obviously you've got Kubernetes, but you have public cloud Kubernetes, you have Anthos, you have EKS Anywhere, you've got, Outpost, you've got Azure Stack on-prem. So
Yeah,
there's so many other ways to think about the public cloud, even when it's on-prem.
yeah,
And if there are, I guess that's where it becomes harder, because now public cloud has evolved in such a way where it actually, I mean, what is public cloud when they go on-prem? Are they classified now as hybrid? I don't even know if what the market research says is now a public cloud provider, now a hybrid cloud provider, because they've got Amazon Outpost and other things. And are they, because I think I would never classify them as that. If somebody asked me what is the public cloud, you wouldn't ever think on-prem. But yet they've now got services that do support on-prem. So there is a bit of a remarketing, repositioning, probably even for the cloud vendors, where they might have to change how they're being seen. And then they're entering the hybrid market then at that point, which is what they're doing. So
yeah.
I'm not sure if customers even know that. Like, I'm not sure if people out there, different companies, are even aware that it doesn't mean you can't now use public cloud just because you are on-prem. Like things have changed. So
Yeah, that's a good thought actually. So you get as well, we've seen where you're wanting to be in, let's say Azure in your example, you're wanting to be in Azure to be at the edge near the customer that you're delivering the service to. You're wanting to make use of all the advanced tooling in the cloud, which if you wind back a couple of years, I don't know what Azure Stack is exactly like now, but it was much more limited a couple of years back. So, but customer has a data center and they've put Azure Stack on it, and then therefore, I mean, it's a little bit of sunk cost fallacy, I would say, but maybe at least in the interim period while that's committed, contractually or strategic partnership or whatever, or they're just wedded to it in some way, then it's cheaper, right? So it can often be cheaper to run then development and test workloads on-prem and then only production workloads in the cloud. So you see that setup as well. So that might be something where you see, like you mentioned, a hybrid on-prem and public cloud with the same provider. But we see it more commonly whether with, like I mentioned, like Pivotal Cloud Foundry or Red Hat or VMware or Oracle or something on-prem, and then they're using Amazon, Google, Microsoft in a limited way in the public, and it's normally a risk aversity.
do you think then? Because straddling, like you were saying before, multi-cloud, they're different APIs, different services, different ways you've got to do it. Terraform obviously is a standard abstraction to a point. The cloud vendors have, even though they are quite different API endpoints, their services are not that dissimilar. They tend to match like for like, but just slightly nuanced each time. Obviously, Kubernetes is the agnostic piece from an application perspective. The app doesn't know any different, and probably developers wouldn't know any different when it comes to Kubernetes. It could be anywhere at that stage. But how is it working then with your kind of straddling cloud and then something like VMware, which is quite different. It's not, the APIs aren't designed quite as well, I would say, arguably, as say the public cloud vendors who were born into a way where they were thinking about APIs and abstractions right from the get go. So is it more complicated, or do people just get on with it and actually isn't that complicated and people have the skills? I don't know what the
Much
answer.
more much more
Yeah.
complicated. I would say it's a situation which you want to be in tactically, temporarily. You don't want to have two operating models, which is ultimately what you end up with, two separate sets of ingress, egress, all those networking. So you've still got basically all of the stuff, teams, licenses that you had before, and now this, you know,
Yeah.
from your organization's point of view, cutting edge bit in separate teams, and these people don't want to work on that, and these people aren't able to understand that. So I think that's where they end up getting buried in technical debt, isn't it? And in legacy, running. That's what kills the transformation efforts, because the budgets then go over and the stakeholders demand, okay, why are we not finished now? And that's how you end up where they go on for years and years. You should, from the beginning, plan to go from one to the other as rapidly as you can. But again, it depends on the constraints, and you need a very well thought out strategy, basically.
Yeah, you do. So so you're saying people are a bit more ring fenced from a skills perspective. So you're going to have even in the DevOps space then as well, or the platform engineering space, where you
Oh
have
yeah, definitely.
right. So you've got obviously the infrastructure side of VMware networking, like you were saying, load balancers. So you're going to have that team, right? Because
Yep.
it's not software defined as it kind of is after it's there, but
Yes.
somebody's got to make it there, and all
Yes.
so we're going to put the networks in place and actually configure it all beforehand, which obviously you don't do with public cloud because they've done that. So you've got
Yes.
that team, and then you've then got DevOps or platform engineering that are then ring fenced to knowing the kind of VMware world, and then you have then another team that kind of understands the more public cloud world, like Amazon or
Yep.
Google. That's
Yep.
interesting. And do they are you trying to get the skills, when you go into an org, were you trying upskill, both, or do you think it's better to kind of ring fence the teams rather than cross pollinate and upskill?
Well, if I'm being very honest, I think you need engineers, and you need to retrain them in security principles and things like this, right? You need people, because the new platforms are made of software. You need software engineers, and can you reskill non-engineers? It's a very long time to learn to become an engineer and learn the software development life cycle. And even platforms now, right? The software defined, and we're checking them in and out, and we're version controlling them. And so I don't think you would want to retrain people in that. I think you would want to hire software engineers and make them appreciate, for the next 4 years or whatever, we're going to be in this hybrid state, and this is where our core banking function or core business function is. And so we need to treat that with the same importance as this shiny new stuff. So that's probably the line, if it was my organization, I would go down, is training the software engineers to have sympathy for the legacy estate, and try and migrate, have sunsetting of the legacy as the priority. And that often, that's not what you see happen. You often
Yeah.
see that it's good for everyone's CVs, including the managers, just to push this bit. And of course, the debt is the legacy. I mean, it's legacy for a reason, right? You want to wrap a veneer around it and then eventually sunset it. So I think more priority could go on sunsetting the old stuff, and understand that right at the beginning, that that's what you're doing, that there's some end in mind.
Yeah. And do you think then, because do you think the reason it's taking longer is because, let me rephrase the question. what do you think slows down the migration process to public cloud? Do you think the modernization and migration is more from the application side, or do you think it's more from the infrastructure side that kind of slows it down?
I think it's the infrastructure side, but it's again, it's like it's software engineers who know platforms, isn't it? So it depends on depends on your priori. But I would say like a good DevOps engineer is a developer who's keen on doing ops, not the other way around. So there's an obviously abundance of people with my past history, you know, system engineers. But unless they're a bit like you, where they've been like hardcore Linux first, they're not that useful, right? If it's people who know, you know, primarily Cisco switches and operating systems and you know, this patching in the data center, that's not really a transferable skill, right? Well,
Yeah,
some of it is, but not much of it. So that's the shortage you get, right? The shortage is software engineers, and then within the software engineer shortage, you know, people who are willing to give up craftsmanship of software and do building utility services, which a lot of, you know, proper developers find boring. They don't want to go into that. So that's where you find the profound shortage. So it's that bit that we see the most shortage of. But then, you know, building really good microservices, you know, people who can do that as well are also lacking, I would say.
yeah. I came across a company that like profiled a bit like tracing it, like trace internally in the application um, for like monolithic apps, and then it could work out how to kind of decouple the application into microservices. So it could work out like what was isolated in the code, as in like what groups, how you could group the code into more microservice architecture, and then kind of split the code out to be like, this should be one microservice, this should be another microservices. So I think there's things going on there in that space to help on the app side, and that's probably just going to keep happening. You know, innovation just always is happening.
I'm sure that's useful, but to me, it's kind of the wrong way around. So to me, what the bit that often gets missed is like doing proper domain-driven design, like actually understanding, okay, what is your current application state? I mean, actually, it's quite few organizations that really understand what they've already got. I'm sure that you've felt and
Yeah,
seen this as well, right? So you need to understand that first, and then to me, you need to do domain-driven design, right? You need to understand the domains of the business. You need to use the language of the business, and decide what it is that you're building, and then carve that out and do it as microservices. So the danger of a tool like that example, although I think if you were on that path that I'm describing, it would be great because it would then provide a utility to say, okay, like here's the low-hanging fruit to do that. But I think that it'd be dangerous for that to drive it because that's like an anti-pattern of domain-driven design, right? To have the way that things were before driving how they
yeah,
should be in the future, or the language of the developer. You know, the ubiquitous language should be the language of the developer should learn the language of the business, not the other way around.
yeah. And I think you're spot on really. And then the goals, or even what we were just saying before, those aren't strategies and goals. And I think you pulled on it a few times where, you know, what is the actual objective? Surely the objective has to be the business logic being
Yeah,
decoupled in such a way that, you know, that's the bit that's making the money for the company.
yeah,
Everything else really is all about is just friction, isn't it?
yeah.
It's friction to that. Like the infrastructure's friction, you know, just to get the application hosted. The clouds can be friction because you've got to understand them all before you can actually deliver on the business logic. You know, it's all these things are all about like the strategy should be like friction free. Really, that should be the strategy. Like just remove all the friction as much as possible so that we're just down to the business logic. And that should be kind of the strategy. And then everything else just
Exactly.
falls past that, doesn't it?
Yeah, and
Uh,
it's strange because we knew this, right? IT originally was like under finance and was a service to the rest of the business, and now, you know, it's right that that software developers are really cherished because they're building the services now because the services are digital. But yeah, I don't quite understand how it became that DevOps called the shots and site reliability called the shots, and obviously those things should be a mean to an end. So I think that's maybe what was behind your comment about. I mean, like to go back to that, your comment about recruitment, and there's a whole thing where the industry is driving the behavior in the enterprise, and surely it should be, look, this is our strategy, this is where our business needs to go, this is how we're competitive, and then we have a hiring strategy that meets that need. So yeah, what did you mean by that comment about recruitment driving things?
Yeah, recruitment driving things. I think you only know what you need. I think to be fair, I think maybe because we've been in the industry a while and probably seen a lot of things, you take for granted your experience, because you've probably seen what works and what doesn't work over time, and you're watching where the industry's going, and you've seen good patterns and bad patterns. And I suppose that comes from dealing with multiple customers, and being privileged to see and compare and contrast, whereas some people might be in the same company for quite a while and not necessarily have that compare and contrast element. So that's when the market starts to drive, them in some ways, because they're hearing these things and it's like, right, okay, well, it's DevOps and it's this, that's what I need, right?
Yeah.
And people only talk about the successes, right? People aren't saying, hey, yeah, we did this thing, but we actually failed 8 million times before we even got here, and it cost us like loads of money. And no one's really willingly going to put themselves forward and say that, like, was that even cost effective, that journey that we just went on? Was that business value? So I think there isn't enough in the industry to talk about what doesn't work and what isn't working well, rather than just, the illusion that innovation is always positive and the roles are always positive. But I think, no, there probably needs to be something in the industry to bring. My advice for like CTOs and others would be to join groups, community groups of yourselves, so that actually can share ideas. I don't think there's enough of that. Maybe the cloud vendors should be bringing the customers together better, to talk through things and share knowledge, because that's the only right way. And then the roles would sit behind that, because then you'd be like, right, okay, now I get what I'm really trying to do, and these are the types of hires I need, and now I can go to market and get them. Whereas without that happening, I kind of feel sorry for, like, if you don't know, you just don't know.
Yeah.
And if you're learning secondhand from the market without the experience, then obviously you're not going to know either. You're just going to do whatever it's telling you. And I imagine the cloud vendors probably equally as frustrated, because the more the more a customer struggles, the less money they'll make, right?
Yes.
So in truth, so they're going to be motivated to have the customer doing well. And also the whole cost thing, they don't really want customers, I don't think, spending that amount of money in the cloud, because it risks,
and not getting a result that they can showcase. Yeah.
exactly, it's a risk to them, that if that noise starts to happen where it's not worth the money, it's more expensive and all this other stuff, and it's like, well, you can do lots of things badly, not just the cloud. Lots of things can be done badly and cost a lot of money. It doesn't mean, that you go backwards. You need to kind of work out the right thing. So I don't think the cloud vendors are incentivized to either to want it. So I think the talent lacking and the groups and the roles, there probably needs to be more community centricity. But I think the roles, like you're saying, if you can't clarify the roles, then you're not going to know why you need them, other than the fact that you probably need them. You see what I mean? Because other people have them, so you're like, well, that's just what people have, so therefore
Yes.
I'm just going to get the same.
Yes.
But again, it's not down to a strategy. So I think with customers, do you help them with the strategy? Then do you get involved to try and coerce the right conversations so that you can at least help the customers properly, rather than just...
We do. We try and give them our opinion, especially if it's early and they're not suffering from some cost fallacy. And it can be difficult, right? If you've already committed, if the CEO has already gone into a strategic relationship with someone, or they've already spent a year working up this plan. But yeah, the sooner that you can get it back on track, and that's what we try and do. We generally discourage them from trying to build platform engineering teams in house, and that's why we exist as an organization. Is because that, like we talked about before, that should be temporary. And yeah, we try and build communities as well. So especially when we do government stuff, they're not competitors, right? So they often see each other as competitors, but shouldn't. So we try and get them together, as you suggested, so that they can follow the ones that have got the success patterns. And I do think there's like perverse incentives, right? To, like you rightly put your finger on, if you're trying to attract talent, then the mindset is, okay, we have to project success, and there's then this race condition of who's the furthest ahead, and like you suggested, there's a cherry picking of only the success cases, which doesn't really represent the reality. So there's those perverse incentives, and then obviously recruitment agencies are typically set up that they make a percent of a placed head count. So the higher that price, then the better they do. Obviously, the contractor or the individual does better if that price is inflated. So I guess it follows the hype curve like almost everything else in that sense, I'm sure. I'm sure it's not different to any other hype curve or any other rule, but I don't know, you notice it and I notice it. It does seem quite profound in this particular case. But yeah, they should be driven by strategy, not by recruitment.
Do you think the industry's been honest then about the problems that exist? As in, like, all the terms as well, like all the different paradigms, like GitOps and talking about that. But let's be honest, that's like not really anything new, just infrastructure as code rebranded. But then it doesn't really tell you anything. It's just like a way of working, kind of. And then again, I'm not sure even how mature the strategies are there. Like, how does that work at scale? What happens when you've got multiple environments and then multiple cloud accounts, multiple environments per cloud account? How do you do all that with GitOps? Are you branching? Are you like, do you know what I mean? Is that all these different things that maybe haven't been thought about, but everyone's talking about how amazing it is.
Yeah.
And like, you need to do it. And you're like, a bit like DevOps was and all these other things. And it tends to be a bit like that in the industry. It's all quite hyped up as if everything's got the answer in it. Yes. And it's like, so do you think there's honesty, as much transparency and honesty in the industry that people are talking enough about what isn't working?
Well, obviously it's not like a singular conscience, so I don't think like it's necessarily honest or dishonest, but it's exactly as you said. It's more attractive to talk about the latest shiny thing and the hype. And I don't know, like for me, I often think, can we not just concentrate on getting like what's in the Agile Manifesto, like working software before documentation? Like we don't need a new principle. Like we have that very old principle, and how many organizations are observing it, or test-driven development, or like I say, even DevOps is relatively old now. So yeah, I would rather see things like XP, and I would rather see some mastery, or at least a high level of attainment on some of these old patterns that really matter, before being driven by hype on particular implementations. And so there's no doubt, right, when it be something like Kubernetes, I mean, you might have seen that Dilbert cartoon take off of it, and so that can suffer from it as well. But I think the difference is there that it's already ubiquitous, right? It's the only game in town. So for that, like, if you are going to do microservices style architecture and you are going to hire real humans to come and do it, like, it is going to be Kubernetes, right? So I think once they become ubiquitous, that hype argument goes away, right? But yeah, I think for these other new shiny things, I mean, they're all great, actually. I don't think there's any pretenders out there that have, some are more useful than others, and you can argue that all day. But something like Git and then GitOps and infrastructure as code, I mean, they're all, when you read through the best practices, that they're all noble and you should be doing them. But I would just ask, have you mastered, is the organization agile first? Have you adopted kind of immutable infrastructure first? Are you following even Git? And that's often not the case, right? Often you have these different it's so ironic, right? But you have these silos that the organizations are more siloed than ever in some ways. You've got all these different clans within the organization. You have centralized platform teams, as you alluded to, and they're adopting their own thing. So one of the things we try and use is like a technology roadmap and a technology radar, and we try and centralize the design authority and the decision making, and bring experts in from all of those different teams. And it can be seen as putting the brakes on and dampening the innovation, but really customer is often trying to do too much and not getting anything done. So we bring it back to, okay, like, what is the principle that we're trying to adhere to? Are we trying to test first, or are we trying to improve agility? And okay, should we just maybe talk about these foundational blocks, in our opinion, that you need first? So that's one thing that we try and do, is just bring it back down to basics. And often it's hard, right? Because they're already 3 years into that journey and they don't want to go back to that, but they're not really going back. They're really mastering something that they should have mastered right at the outset. So that's the challenge, right? If politically part of the organization thinks it's ready, in your example, ready for GitOps, we would say, well, have you actually got infrastructure as code everywhere yet? Are you doing policy? Are you actually doing Git in development successfully yet?
Yeah, you're spot on there. I think that's good that you're doing that, because you're right. I suppose it is. Yeah, if you've got so far to admit that you're going too fast in too many directions, and then you need to reorder yourself, it's just basically like regrouping. But the education, I think, like you were saying, if there's a skills deficit in the industry, like anything, you're only as good as the talent that you manage to get in. That's the same with anything. You could apply it to literally anything, builders, any tradesman, like literally anything, right? The job's going to be only as done well as the person and the people that you're bringing in.
Yeah.
But the education, though, the guidance for the customer on what it all means, and the principles you were saying, like what's the value add of those ways of working and why are they important, and to educate everyone on it first before you then implement and do. So that everyone's on the same page and there's no illusions on like what it actually meant. Because it's funny, because I think I've been in meetings where people have different perceptions of what the things mean, and they've been doing them for a while. And you could be in a meeting, you can clearly tell that everyone's got a slightly different view of roughly the same types of things. So people will be saying words, but what they're meaning to someone else is slightly different to what they might mean to someone else. I mean, you're all, really the room's in this slight state of confusion about what it all actually means. And you can see that, and you think, well, if that's in your company, then yeah, you're probably not going to get very far, because you're already starting off on the wrong foot. So yeah. And so what do you see next then for yourselves at Codification? Are you progressing with the clouds, doubling down on the platform engineering side, helping customers more on the agile aspects, or a bit of everything?
Well, the best relationship for us is when we're offering all of that, and we're like a trusted partner, and the customer accepts that it's a complex challenge, it's a multi-year challenge. So where we can have a relationship where we can honestly assess where they're at. So that's one of the tools that we use, is, you can make those arguments, but ultimately they can be political. There can be another supplier there, or even when there's not very opinionated people in the organization, like you rightly said, you can have, multiple people using a word but meaning different things by it. So one of the things we try and do is like a terms of reference, and we try and use, standard, try not let the organization come up with its own terminology, but use standard tools and standard language to describe those tools, and standard methodologies that are proven. And we try and do assessment somewhat by stealth. So rather than going around saying, okay, we're going to assess everyone, we'll often be engaged to do a narrow form of assessment, which we'll then broaden out. So we'll be engaged to do like a platform maturity assessment, but then we'll broaden it out into saying, okay, how is the testing being done? What's the self-service like for developers? And then you're actually into people in process. So where we can get that level of trust to be able to do those sorts of things, we can get much better results. And then especially if they engage us to kind of assess everything out in the open, which is rare, to be fair, because we're a small startup and not that well known. So that can happen in, maybe we've done some small one-off projects and then we've built up the trust, and then we've made our way up to the kind of senior leadership, and then they say, okay, tell us where we're really at. And then what we can do is compare the scores on multiple narrow things and say, okay, when you compare these in aggregate, it kind of gives you a level of maturity. Let's compare that with our other customers. Let's compare that with people in your industry or different industry or where you're trying to get to. So that can work, giving them this like objective comparison. So obviously we don't disclose who that other customer was or break any kind of confidentiality there, but we just say, okay, another client in this sector, this is how they scored. This is where they're up to on their journey. This is their perception of themselves before the assessment. This is the reality of what the assessment showed. So we do that sort of thing. And we do like lab-based training of their people as well. So we can actually get the capability assessment there. So they send, again, we can ask them, where do you think this team is at? Okay, this, after 6 weeks of instruction, this is how well they followed the instruction. This is how well they completed the assignments. This is how your team compares to a different team in the organization. It's maybe in a completely different leadership structure, different incentives. So they can find that, eye-opening as well. And then again, you can compare the capability to the outside world. So that's what we like. And we can compare new joiners that maybe have been through some kind of codification bootcamp before joining and then put on a project and then assessed versus someone that they're trying to upskill or someone they haven't given the proper time to achieve the upskilling. So all of those things we can kind of help them with. So it doesn't matter to us if they're really struggling or they're really advanced. Our team is technically always in advance of their team because they're not a technology company. They're trying to become one. So we've got no real strong opinion of what they ought to be. We just try and show them, okay, this is where you thought you were, and this is where you really are. This is where you're trying to get to, and this is the gap. And then we can help across the board, right? We can help by augmenting them with engineers, be it platform engineers or cloud engineers or whatever. We can retrain the teams, or we can hire new permanent staff for them.
Nice. And if somebody wanted to get in touch, how do they get hold of yourselves? If they're like listened and were like, oh, that is what we need, like we're in a bit of a tricky situation at the moment and maybe need to get yourselves in.
The website, codification.io, would be the one-stop shop.
The place to go. Cool. All right. Well, it's been great chatting to you, Richard. And thanks for spending the time, obviously, to come on the podcast and talk about these things with everybody. Hopefully somebody got something out of it who's listening. And obviously, as you heard, you can reach out to codification.io. If there's things there and you think they can help, then please do reach out. So awesome.
Thank you, John. Thanks for inviting me. It's been great.
Cheers. Thanks.
Bye.